What's going on, guys? My name is Valerio and welcome to another tutorial here on our channel, The Guide. Now, in tons of our videos, we often get requests for player switching tutorials, and that's exactly what we have for you today. There are quite a few things to cover when we're talking about player switching. It all begins with the relevant controller settings that you guys need to be aware about, and then progressing into the different types of player switches, when to use them, how to know why they're important, and then combining it all together. So in today's video, we're going to try and show you guys all of that I just mentioned and the logic behind certain switching decisions, all of which to hopefully help understand when to use the right stick, when to use the L1 or LB button, because that's the most important part that once mastered will allow you guys to implement your own strategies to think ahead of your opponents. Now, if after today's video you are interested in even more ways to increase your efficiency in player switching, our online course covers this topic even further. Now, in this course, you will find 25 exclusive videos covering various topics that can help you get through a FIFA plateau. We're currently running a 40% sale on the course using the code THEGUIDE40. So if you want, by clicking the link in the description box down below, the code will be automatically applied. Now let's get straight into the video. First things first, when dealing with player switching, there are a few controller settings to be aware of, and we have a dedicated video that goes in depth on every single setting and our personal recommendations for them. So if you haven't checked it out, you can click on the top right of your screen or in the description down below and go through every single controller setting on this game. Really briefly though, when looking at player switching, the first thing to be aware of and the first setting to be aware of is the second defender switch icon. If you have it on, it will be a clear version of the red indicator that you usually see, and this symbolizes the player that you'll swap to if opting to switch using the L1 or LB button. What you choose for this comes down to personal preference. Personally, I've used it both on and off for longer periods of time, and I often find myself switching, but to begin with, I definitely keep it on and make use of it. Once you've got the basics and the foundations, once you've got enough experience under your belt, you can remove it if it ends up being a distraction. Up next is the auto switching setting. You have a choice between air balls and loose balls, which means that it is up to you to switch players, and the only time the CPU will switch for you is during high air balls and loose balls. The second option is auto, where the CPU takes the majority of the control. And finally, manual, where in every single situation, it is completely up to you to switch. The important thing here is just to not select auto, because to get better, you will have to make the switches yourself. Manual is possible, but at the end of the day, the best bang for your buck is to go for air balls and loose balls, giving you all the control you need and helping you in uncomfortable situations where for the most part the CPU does a good job at switching for you. The last setting is the right stick switching mode. This is a new one and was introduced in FIFA 20, and you can choose between player relative, which if you have played FIFA before FIFA 20 has been the default setting with no other alternatives. In this mode, the player you have selected is the center point or reference for any right stick switch. So a flick towards the right will always select the player to the right of who you have currently selected. The second option is ball relative, and here the anchor point is the ball. Without going too deep into this, we strongly recommend sticking with the classic player relative mode. It's just important to let you guys know about it and what it is, but that's about it. It comes down to the fact that ball relative switches make it hard for you to select players away from the ball, which not only make you a very one-dimensional defender, but it also leaves you susceptible to long through balls, and it makes it harder for you to anticipate when selecting a center back. The last thing to cover in terms of the basics is how to actually switch. The first way is by using the L1 or LB button, which will always look to select the player closest to the ball. And of course, second, you have the right stick switch, where you flick the stick in the direction of the player you want selected, giving you far more control. So let's get into both of them, when to use them, and finally the combination of both of them together. You may have often heard the best FIFA players are great at defending because they have mastered their right stick switching. And while that is true, it's important not to completely forget about the L1 button switch. The key is not to go from it being the only way you switch to never using it, but rather to strike the balance and make use of its strengths alongside right stick player switching. Now, when player switching, sometimes things will go wrong, and regardless of whether it's your fault for aiming incorrectly or the game just momentarily screwing up a little bit, the best thing you can do in those cases where you keep right stick switching and never getting your desired target is to use the L1 button as a means to reset the play. Here, for example, I was desperately trying to get my second CDM selected via right stick switching. My first attempt failed and brought me to my center back. I try again, but the game brings me to one of my outside midfielders as opposed to my CDM. And by this point, enough time has passed to where the ideal switch is my cam and not my CDM. So at this point, I decide to press the L1 button as a reset and finally get hold of a player in the middle of the field, which finally allows me to run towards the ball holder. Here on out, nothing spectacular occurs defensively, but by resetting in the moment, I was able to get a hold of a central player, regain my confidence without wasting any more time with bad player switches, and I felt in control of a play that eventually led to a shot that posed us no threat. Another moment to incorporate the L1 switch in your defense is to use it in medium to long range passes that your opponent plays into a striker or offensive player. Here, for example, as my opponent works down the wing, it gets increasingly obvious that he wants to feed his striker on the edge of my box. So once the pass is made, rather than player switching with my right stick and putting myself at risk of messing up and being a step late, I can bypass that risk by pressing the L1 button. As you can see, it does select our center back closest to the ball, but most importantly closest to our opponent in this situation, and it gives him no time to work with the ball on the edge of our box. Before we get into when to use right stick switching so we can understand the contrast to the L1 switch, how can you actually get better if you struggle and you feel uncomfortable with right stick player switching? Practice makes perfect, and the more reps you can make use of, the better. In game, a really good area to do this is when your opponent has the ball in their half. These are situations where you have nothing to lose and everything to gain, and a perfect opportunity to force yourself to only use the right stick and practice quickly switching between your offensive players. Also, as we have mentioned in previous player switching tutorials, the same concept applies to a lot of dead ball situations. For example, when your opponent has a goal kick, make sure to always use your right stick to select players all over the pitch and cover the options you think he will go for. On throw-ins, make it as hard as possible using the right stick and cover all of the options that you can find. Moving on though, I would argue the main use for right stick switching is to make use of the ability that you have when using it to move towards anyone you want on the pitch and thus cover dangerous runs or use it to anticipate your opponent. Here, for example, I am facing an opponent that pushes a lot down the wings with his fullbacks, putting me in uncomfortable 2v1 situations. His fullback is wide open and you can see him at the very edge of the screen, and I definitely need to do something about this. Rather than putting my fullback on him and covering the dangerous area with my fullback, I want to select my outside cam in Hulk and block the area with him. One reason for that is if I use my fullback to defend his fullback, it does exactly what my opponent wants and it gives him the edge by taking away a defender of mine and making me push him away from one of his offensive players. Also, in this situation, you can see that my fullback is already preoccupied in a relatively central position, pushing onto an opponent. Using the right stick in this situation gives me full control to switch to Hulk and jockey in a way that blocks the dangerous through pass trajectory, pushing my opponent somewhere completely different. And that's the beauty of player switching. It allows you to freely go wherever you feel is the highest risk and take care of business. Other than covering and tracking runs, right stick switching becomes necessary also to prepare yourself to anticipate an opponent. Here, we're in a dangerous situation. Our center is completely wide open, and it's pretty obvious that our opponent will try and make use of it by putting me in a 1v1 situation against his striker. The only way to avoid this situation is to select my Sergio Ramos, and the only way to select him at this point is via right stick switching to him in time, which as you can see, is exactly what we do. The right stick is the tool that allows you to get where you want to be when you want to be there. The final goal then obviously becomes to learn how to subconsciously combine the two without having to think about it. Now, the foundations have been explained, and with trial and error, you get to learn smart ways to use them together in combination. And it doesn't have to look fancy. In fact, more often than not, it's small, crafty situations that bring the best out of combining the two. In this scenario, our opponent runs at us despite being at a disadvantage in terms of number. The reason why this is still relatively easy for him to get out of is because moves like the 180-degree drag back exit exist. But with crafty player switching, you can help bypass that sometimes and put him under pressure that he didn't even expect. So what we do here is that once we have our Allen behind him enough to cover the center, we right stick switch to our Zambrotta. Had he continued the run, he would have run into me and it would have been a really easy way to regain possession. As you can see though, he is quick to realize that, and he starts to perform the drag back and obviously trying to escape by exiting the other way. This is where the combination of right stick and L1 comes in though, because our Allen is closest. A quick L1 switch in combination to our previous right stick allows us to reselect Allen so quickly that, as you can see, even though he passes it back, he has no time to completely get away, and we easily win the ball back. The purpose of this player switching video was to help you guys understand the differences between the two ways to switch players, because together, and the key word here is together, they work in a way that allow you to quickly cover ground. It becomes a mistake when people decide to only use one method and neglect the other. So hopefully this video can help you guys start to learn how to have them play off of each other. Other things to keep in mind are also that quantity doesn't necessarily trump quality. Not switching is bad, but so is over switching, because it can make you lose yourself in panic. So striking a balance is very important. Anyways, that's gonna be it for me today. I hope this was useful, and if it was, don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll catch you guys next time. We also want to thank our elite supporters over on Patreon, and if you're interested, you can become a patron today to support the channel as well as receive cool benefits in return over at patreon.com/BPG the guide.